Curtis Eugene Ezell, last name spelled Ezell, was baptized in the name of the Father and the Son and of the Holy Spirit on the 24th day of January 1993 by Pastor Dr. Alan Damron, Woodbridge Baptist Church, Mobile, Alabama. Curtis was born the 27th of June 1953 in Camp Gordon, Georgia, County Richmond. The hospital was a U.S. Army hospital. He lived at 3050 Deansbridge Road. His father was 24 and mother 22 years of age at the time of his birth. While he lived on Deansbridge Road, Curtis was ran over by a car, Studebaker, owned by his parents. Unknowingly, his sister Carolyn was playing in the car, hit the stick shift out of position, and the car started rolling back and injuring Curtis. Had it not been for the sand he covered himself with it since and may have killed him. He was rushed by his father to Fort Gordon Hospital base on 16 March 1956 and was treated there for fracture of 7th, 8th, 9th, and 10th ribs on the left side anteriorly and a small tear, posterior surface, right below the liver. Ether was used. As he still show fair status. Although his memories coming up or few, he tells of some. He recalls one of moving around a lot, for instance California, Orange, Texas, Dallas, Texas, Henderson, Texas, and Tennessee were some places, but wherever they moved he recalls returning back to Mobile, Alabama. While we lived in Mobile we moved to Duval Street, Broad Street, Texas Street, Selma Street, also in Crichton. He also recalls some of the schools he attended, which was as followed: Irwin, Craighead, Russell, Arlington, and Woodcock School. When Curtis was young it was a time of watching television, like the show I Love Lucy, Captain Kangaroo, Howdy Doody, hosted by Bob Smith, Lassie Show, Mickey Mouse Show, The Rifleman, and The Lone Ranger. He recalls hearing on radio and television the day Kennedy was shot, and the day when bullets killed Martin Luther King and Robert Kennedy. Curtis's father drank heavily, but when it was time to work it was tugs, or some kind of vote. He knew of all kinds of boatmen. Some would stop by the house where a great amount of drinking was done. This was often a recurrence as Curtis was growing up. One thing comes to mind was a time when Curtis's parents had taken him and all his brothers and sisters downtown to the state docks, where there was a bar standing on pilings in the water by the shore. Close to the wharf, where the boats would come in to unload their wares, you would find bananas laying around green and still hard on the wharf. It was at that bar, in a car setting and waiting till both parents would come out, that is what stands most in his memories. William, who was the father of Curtis, was also sometimes called Bill, had a drinking buddy named Jimmy Rose. His wife Gertrude, they had 2 children, a boy named Norman and a girl whose name is unknown at this time. When Gertrude whipped her son it was with a blow with her open hand. Curtis and his family live at Rose from the Lucky Lounge on Duval Street in Mobile, Alabama. It was there, on Duval Street, where Curtis recalls most memories, his best friend Junior Hollingsworth, not to forget the Saxons, and also the Wilkerson family. If he didn't live at 1813 Duval Street it was 1865 1/2 Duval, right behind his great-aunt Nora, who later died at 1865. She was laying on her bed at the time. Her husband, Emmett Mullany, worked as a painter by trade and was a very heavy drinker. Curtis's grandmother Esther, on the Ezell side, said he grieved himself to death after Nora Mullany. It was on February 1, 1967, when she died. Curtis recalls Nora, his great-aunt, would cut out pictures from magazines so she could hang them on her wall. Also, he said one night as he stayed there sleeping on the floor with a blanket located in her room, he found it very quiet that night and Nora sleeping on her back and no sound could you hear. When morning came she asked what he wanted for breakfast. She treated him like her son. Curtis said he noticed her looking out her front window one day, and after seeing a dead dog by the road upset her. The remark she said as she gasped was, "How awful, poor dog," as she turned her head away from the window. There was one other time, recalled by Curtis, when his sister Carolyn and him was playing at Duval Park. Both had since from school, and Carolyn decided to leave and go home. After she was completely gone, 2 boys confronted him. They were a lot older than him and may have been lying in wait for Carolyn. What followed next was both boys forced Curtis to the ground holding both hands down while he vigorously tried to get up with no prevail. He was asked by both boys as to who was the girl he was with. He responded to say that she was his sister. Again he was asked if he knew where she was going. He replied home. After this he was set free and both boys finally went their way. Although Curtis lived on Duval Street at 3 locations, it was always close to his friends who he played with a lot, and it was the Hollingsworth family that made him feel like part of their family and thought it would be great if Curtis was part of their family. He also recalls Junior Hollingsworth and Terry Wilkerson and him were playing in Duval Park. That's what they called the park, were roasting winners, when all of a sudden Terry, playing with a fire which they had made, had set the nearby brush on fire. What Terry had done was more than they thought he would do, and so they all ran. They came back later while the firemen were there and was asked by one fireman, did they know who had caused the fire? All 3 of them responded with the answer, don't know. In 1971, Curtis left with his mother to move to Atlanta, Georgia. She was staying with a cab driver named Franklin at the time. He offered to get him a job there, which he thought was great. When he arrived in Atlanta with his mother Betty along with Franklin, they stayed in a small apartment. Franklin kept his promise and did get Curtis a job working in a restaurant called Denny's. He worked September 15, 1971 to November 30, 1971. The location was St. De Leon. In 1974, at the age of 20, his uncle Nathan Lawrence helped to pay his way in a trade school working on television repair, located at Dauphin Island Parkway and Myrtle Street. In June 1977, Curtis was staying in Moss Point, Mississippi with his sister Carolyn and her husband John Simon Chaudron. His name is spelled Chaudron. It was there, on 4431 Blackwell Street, where he learned to feed honeybees and planting corn, but found the corn thickly overgrown later. By 1978, Curtis stayed with uncles Leo, Werner Lawrence, and Harold Lawrence in Magnolia Springs, where his other uncle Nathan Lawrence had a lease on a house. Curtis had a job on the SETA program. The name of the job, SETA, was spelled C-E-T-A. Also, he raised 62 chickens. Some were red color and some black and white. There was also a garden full of everything. In this paragraph, I like to point out that if it had not been for Donna, his sister, and Bernard, his uncle, coming over to visit Carolyn and John that day and talking to Curtis on leaving Moss Point and going back with him, the following events may not have happened, including Ricky Nelson and Tracy Newman wouldn't have seen each other. Also, Curtis would not have worked at the shelter. Yes, Curtis had thought of not leaving, but John, thinking Curtis had already decided to leave, got mad and after saying a few words, told Curtis if he was going, then leave now. After hearing what was being said by John, Curtis did leave with Bernard and Donna. After leaving, while in the car with Bernard and Donna, Curtis was so upset with the sudden changes in his life he began to cry and was in bitter grief. As time passed, later Curtis and John made up with each other, and he visited him often before he died. After staying with his uncles and working on SETA in Magnolia Springs, he transferred to Mobile, Alabama, where the office of SETA was located. This was June 1978. When he arrived in Mobile, M-O-V-I-L-E, the SETA program arranged him to work at the animal shelter. In 1981, he was living at the animal shelter where he worked. This is also where Eddie Phillips, a co-worker, introduced him to Linda Hagler, spelled H-A-I-G-L-E-R, maiden name Jordan. In 1981 of the same year he was introduced to Linda. They were married at a church located at Farnell Drive and Nanco Road by Dr. Patterson. On December 1982 he became an animal control officer. In 1986, Linda had a miscarriage. Why and what reason this unborn did not make it, he will never know. Linda, the mother of the unborn, was seeing a doctor. Curtis, the husband hoping to be the father of the unborn, recalls going with Linda to see the doctor, where she had a close examine. As Curtis listened to the nurse who was performing the scan, the nurse indicated to Linda that she observed the formation of a baby and pointed out to her some features of a baby and a detail of some character of parts. Although Curtis himself had a hard time seeing it, he assumed what she was saying was true. During the pregnancy of Linda, as recalled by Curtis, they had just moved to some apartments on Westwood Street, and Curtis had purchased an old motorcycle from a pawn shop off Halls Mill Road. It wasn't running at the time, and he had loaded it on a